Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, it is week 5 of the 2024 NFL season. So we're going to do our weekly NFL show buy or sell. Basically, we're going to talk about some guys that I really like it from a fantasy perspective this week, guys that I want to make sure I'm starting in my season-long fantasy lineups. I want to make sure I play them in daily fantasy on DraftKings and FanDuel, and I want to make sure that I hit the overs in the player props market. Those guys are going to be on my buy list. And we're also going to talk about some guys that I want to put on the bench in season-long fantasy, that I want to fade in DFS formats, and that I want to take the unders in the player prop markets. Those guys are going to be on the sell list. So, every fantasy analyst, they have their love, hate, like, dislike, start, sit, whatever. We're making it money themed at Mike's Money Picks, and it is buy or sell. So we're going to go over that for each position and hopefully give you guys plenty of good information that whether you're coming here for season-long fantasy advice, DFS plays, or player props advice, we got you covered here. We're going to talk about some players in a way that, you can get all-in-one information done. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the quarterbacks. But I do want to say, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. That way you can be with us for the rest of the NFL season, in addition to all of our college football content that comes out weekly and golf content that comes out weekly and upcoming college basketball content that's going to be coming up weekly. So we got a lot going on here at Mike's Money Picks. If you're subscribed, you can be here for all of it. Let's go ahead and dive in week 5, 2024 season. All right, so let's go ahead and kick things off with the quarterback position. So first quarterback on the buy list this week is going to be Jayden Daniels of the Washington Commanders. Look, I think it is time to admit that Jayden Daniels is just a top 5 fantasy quarterback, if not better than that. Honestly, I think you can make the argument that he's top 3, top 2 even. He's had over 25 fantasy points in 3 of his 4 starts. He is the number 1 quarterback in fantasy through 4 weeks of the season. He is doing it with his arm in addition to his legs, which is what we love from a fantasy perspective. Rushing points for quarterbacks are like a cheat code, and he's just been incredible. Like, if you're a Washington Commanders fan, how can you not be so excited to have this guy as your quarterback for the next decade? The crazy stat I've seen on Jayden Daniels is that he has led more scoring drives than incompletion so far this season. That's just absolutely bananas. Like he's been incredibly efficient. He's been great from a fantasy perspective. Cannot stress enough how good he's been through the first 4 weeks of the NFL season. And so I think he's a guy that if you drafted him, you just got to start. Like, he's an every week starter from this point forward until further notice. And really this week, the matchup against Cleveland is pretty bad. Cleveland is a top 5 fantasy defense against quarterbacks, but I'll be honest, I don't care. I think Jayden is just that good. And even if, the Browns are a tough pass defense, well, Jayden can get it done with his legs. So I'm not super concerned about any matchup at this point. And I really think unless you drafted Josh Allen in season long, he would be my play. Like I think you got to start Jayden Daniels over everybody who's not named Josh Allen at this point. Now, next up on the buy list is going to be Jordan Love. This is a guy who I was very high on in the preseason and continue to be high on, and last week it does not change my opinion at all. He appeared to have no sort of lingering issues from the knee in his game against Minnesota, putting up 34 DraftKings points in that game. And really, the matchup this week is just sublime. The Rams defense is really banged up. They've got injuries at every level. They lead the league in passing yards per attempt allowed, which means that pretty much they allow quarterbacks to be more efficient against them than any other defense. And they've given up big games in fantasy so far this season to Jared Goff, Kyler Murray, and Brock Purdy. I think that Jordan Love is going to add to the list. Also, from a DFS perspective, you always want to stack your quarterback with a wide receiver when you play daily fantasy. And really, with the injury to Christian Watson, it kind of narrows down the Packers target tree a little bit. It really makes it easier to pinpoint which Packers receivers are going to go off. Last week, it was Jaden Reed and Dontavion Wicks, and guess what? This week, I would be willing to bet that it's going to be Jaden Reed and Dontavion Wicks again. Dontavion Wicks, I just think is really good. Like, he just seems to always be in the right spot, always seem to catch the ball. I feel like I never see him drop a pass. And then Jaden Reed, they just get the ball in so many different creative ways. The Packers are looking to get the ball in his hands. And that's the kind of guy you want to play in fantasy because the team makes it really easy to get him touches, makes it really easy to score fantasy points for him. Now, on the sell list at the quarterback position, we got 2 this week. Oh, I forgot to do that if you're desperate. So if you are desperate at the quarterback position this week, Anthony Richardson is questionable. And if he does, in fact, miss the game, Joe Flacco would be, to me, a guy that you could get a spot start from in fantasy. Jacksonville is one of the worst pass defenses in the league. Joe Flacco looked quite good last week when he came in relief of Anthony Richardson against Pittsburgh. It's insane. I don't know how Joe Flacco honestly looked awful from like 2017 to 2020, takes like a 3-year break, and now he's like good. It makes zero sense. I don't understand it. But anyway, if Anthony Richardson misses, Joe Flacco is a guy that I do think you can start in season-long fantasy. I do think he's a great value playing DFS. I forgot. I almost skipped over it. Basically, the The if you're desperate list is basically some guys that if you need to find a spot starter, maybe off the waiver wire, or somebody's got a buy or an injury in season-long fantasy, or if you're looking for a value play in DFS, those are the guys that I classify as if you're desperate. And Joe Flacco is my if you're desperate quarterback of the week. Now, the sell list has a population of 2 this week. First up is going to be Dak Prescott. Look, he is throwing the ball all the time. That's the one good thing he has going for him. His offense has zero interest in running the ball, and so he is throwing it a ton. There's a ton of passing volume, but he hasn't been all that efficient with it. He does not rate very highly in terms of yards per attempt. And oh, by the way, the Pittsburgh defense is, in my opinion, the best one in football. I just don't think this is a great spot for Dak. I think if you can avoid playing him in season-long fantasy, he would be a guy that I would certainly try to avoid. I also think Kyler Murray is a guy to avoid. He's the second quarterback on my sell list this week. He's only had 1 game out of 4 where he scored above 16 fantasy points. That's not good. Like that's not like starter quality, honestly. And he's going up against the 49ers, who are 9th best against quarterbacks this season from a fantasy perspective. So it's not a good matchup. I just don't really see this being a game where he scores a ton of fantasy points. His usage in the run game, like he was decent through the first 3 weeks, but it really was just because he broke off one big run and then the others were just kind of okay. Really didn't run a whole lot last week, only run attempts. So I don't really know what's going on with his usage in this offense, but I don't really want to find out this week against San Francisco. I will catch back up with Kyler when his box scores start looking a little bit more promising and when the matchup starts looking a little bit better. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the running backs now. So the buy list at running back, population 2 up first is King Henry himself, Derrick Henry. So basically, when Baltimore signed Derrick Henry in free agency, this was kind of like if you're a team in the AFC, everyone's fear that an offense who runs the ball a ton, usually plays from ahead, gets a guy who is at his best when he's getting a lot of high volume, at his best when, no matter what the formation is, no matter what the alignment is, he's getting the football and he just runs over your entire defense, right? Like that's what Derrick Henry does. And he has been that in the last 2 weeks for Baltimore. He scored over 33 fantasy points against Dallas and Buffalo. DraftKings scoring, by the way. And also the Ravens have led the NFL in rush rate over expectation in the last 2 weeks. What does that mean? Well, pass rate and rush rate over expectation measure what teams do in terms of what they're expected to do, whether they're expected to throw or run based off of the given situation that they're in terms of the score, down and distance, all that. Well, the Ravens are leading the league in rush rate over expectation, meaning that they're running the ball a whole lot more than they theoretically should be. And that is good news for Derrick Henry. He's probably going to see 20-plus carries in this game, which should be enough for him to put up a big score. The Bengals just gave up 100 rushing yards to Chuba Hubbard and the Panthers, so if Chuba can do it, Derrick Henry can do it. And oh, by the way, the Ravens are favored in this game. And you go back about 5 years, all the way back to 2020, and Henry averages about 9 more fantasy points per game in wins than in losses. So this all just bodes very well for Derrick Henry to have a big game against Baltimore in a Baltimore Ravens victory. Next up, we've got Kyren Williams. And look, I'm going to continue to bang the drum. Everybody wants to say, oh, everybody on the Rams offense is hurt. They can't do anything. I don't know whose voice that was supposed to be, but Kyren Williams is a guy that I'm going to continue to hype up because when the Rams offense loses talented skill players, they tend to lump their usage around the talented skill players they have remaining, and that has been the case for Kyren Williams. Each of the last 2 weeks, which have been played without Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, he's put up 31.6 DraftKings points and 20.4 DraftKings points. He's had usage in the passing game in both weeks. He's scored touchdowns on the ground in both weeks. There's no concern from me over the rest of the Rams offense. They're going to get the ball to Kyren. And oh, by the way, I think the Packers are a decent look in terms of a team to target. They have given up the 4th most receiving yards to running backs so far this season. Kyren Williams is a guy who can catch the ball out of the backfield. And if the Rams are down, they're certainly going to be throwing to him out of the backfield. So I think this is a really good combination for Kyren Williams to have another big week. Next up, we got the if you're desperate section. So basically, one source of potential value in fantasy football is when a backfield committee becomes a committee no longer. And how does that usually happen? By somebody getting hurt. And so there's a chance that that could happen for multiple teams this week. Travis Etienne and Tank Bigsby are both questionable for Jacksonville. I love either one of them if they're the only running back of the 2 that plays. Dearness Johnson would be the 3rd guy in line if both of them are out that should see a ton of work. We don't really know how that's going to shake out in terms of whether those guys are active or not, but I'm just mentioning it on here. Brian Robinson Jr. and Austin Eckler are both questionable for the Washington Commanders. And if one of them plays, I like that one guy. If neither neither of them play, then Jeremy McNichols would be a guy that would be in line for a ton of work. We've got another questionable running back in Zamir White. And if Zamir White does not play, that should open up a lot of work for Alexander Madison, who has actually been deceptively good this season, deceptively efficient. And if Zamir White is not going to play, then I think that even further opens the door for Madison to have a big game. So he's another guy that I would mention. And then Jonathan Taylor, it also very well could miss this week. Trey Sermon would be the beneficiary in terms of his backup. When Taylor got hurt against Pittsburgh, Sermon played pretty much all the snaps after that. So he's another guy you could go get from waivers or go play for cheap in DFS. And then Roschon Johnson, he's been my guy ever since, he was at Texas. A little bit of a homer pick on my part. But he continues to get usage, and especially continues to get usage in the red zone. He did receive the goal line carry last week against the Rams. So even though DeAndre Swift had a big game, Roschon Johnson was still involved in the game plan, and I think that's going to continue to happen. This new Bears coaching staff offensively really seems to like Roschon and what he does, and I think that he's a good fit for what they do. So Roschon Johnson, $4,900 on DraftKings, definitely a guy you could find on the waivers in your season-long fantasy leagues. Now, on the sell list, we've only got one this week. And it's going to be Zach Moss, because I'll be honest, he has multiple reasons to sell him. Pretty much, he's got all the boxes that you look for to not play a running back going against him. He was the first running back in the backfield for the Bengals. Well, now more and more work as the weeks go on is going to Chase Brown. It's becoming closer to a 50-50 split, which is not good for Zach Moss. Baltimore is also the league's best rush defense. No running back has rushed for more than 50 yards against them. They rank third overall in fantasy points allowed to running backs. So it's just a bad matchup in a situation where he's receiving less and less work. Yeah, I'm just going to pass on Zach Moss this week. If you have other guys that you can play in season long, I think that should be your option. All right, let's go ahead and take a quick breather, and then we're going to talk about the pass catchers. Now, before we continue, I do want to mention there are places where you can find more information from me. First off, you can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. I'm more than happy to answer any lineup or start sit questions that you may have. I'm also in the Fantasy Corner Discord. It's certainly a place that caters more to DFS if you play daily fantasy on DraftKings and FanDuel. But if you're looking for a community to talk about strategies and plays with and sweat it out together, the Fantasy Corner Discord is the place to go for that. And we got all sports covered, not just NFL. Also, again, tailored to DFS, I do write articles on my Patreon every single NFL slate detailing my core plays as well as why they're my core plays. You can get those on patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks, and you can also get the plays for college football as well as golf on there as well. Now, if you're looking to try anything new this season in terms of betting, maybe you want to try a new DFS site, maybe you want to try a new player prop site, anything like that, we're partnered with Sign Up Expert. So head on over to signupexpert.com/Mike's Picks, and they will give you the best offers and promo codes for new users for all of those sites, and will even sync to your location to show you what is legal in your state or province. And so if you're looking to try something new, give those offers and promo codes a shot. I promise you will not be disappointed. All right, let's go ahead and pick back up with the pass catchers. So looking at the wide receiver position, DK Metcalf is going to be the first guy on the buy list. He is questionable, but I would personally expect him to play. I don't see why he wouldn't. He kind of played the whole game against Detroit. Basically, DK Metcalf is on a unique run where he's had 3 straight games over 100 receiving yards. That's not very often. But the way this new Seahawks offense under Ryan Grubb is using him, he's basically in like the Romo Dunes role from last year at Washington, which is a very, very lucrative role in terms of how he's getting targeted. And also, the New York Giants, it might not look like it on paper because they do rank 15th against wide receivers, but they are very porous to wide receiver ones. Wide receiver ones are averaging 18.8 fantasy points per game against the Giants so far this season. And really, the ironic part of that is that Justin Jefferson's game against them brings that average down because the Vikings were up by so many points in that game that they didn't really need to throw the ball to Justin Jefferson. So, the wide receiver ones just continue to eat against this team, and DK Metcalf is a guy that I would classify as the Seahawks wide receiver 1. If you're sitting there thinking, well, Mike, over the last 2 weeks, Jackson Smith and Jigba has been more targeted than DK Metcalf. Okay, that's accurate, but DK Metcalf does his work from the outside. All of these wide receiver ones who have feasted against the Giants have been outside receivers as well. Jackson Smith and Jigba does his work from the slot, which the Giants have been a little better against. So DK Metcalf would get the edge for me, but I also wouldn't mind considering Jackson Smith and Jigba for the same thing. Whoever ends up being the lead receiver for the Seahawks should have a great game against the Giants. Now, next up is going to be Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. So we've talked about this stat before where expected fantasy points per game is the stat where it basically kind of normalizes every situation and all the targets that receivers get in terms of, quarterback accuracy, in terms of location on the field, in terms of pure volume, and kind of just says, hey, what should have happened, right? Well, Amari Cooper ranks as wide receiver 4 in expected fantasy points per game so far in the 2024 season. The bad news, if you drafted Amari Cooper, is that he is actually in the 40s in terms of actual wide receiver production. But because he's gotten so many targets and they've just been so inconsistent, he's also had touchdowns wiped out by penalties. He's just been super unlucky. That's how you get the disconnect between his expected fantasy points per game and his actual points per game. Well, this is the ultimate by the regression spot, because theoretically he should be scoring more fantasy points anyway. He should really score a lot of fantasy points against Washington. The Commanders are allowing the most fantasy points to wide receivers this season. And unlike with what we talked about with DK Metcalf, it doesn't matter where you line up against Washington. Inside, outside, slot, tight end, maybe not tight end, but they give fantasy points to receivers like candy. And Amari Cooper, I think, should be the beneficiary in this Cleveland Browns offense. Even though Deshaun Watson, to me, looks like the absolute worst quarterback in football, I do think that there's a pretty good spot for Amari Cooper to kind of buy low by the dip here. Which, quick side point, if you've ever heard guys talk about the phrase he's an even better person than he is a football player, I think Deshaun Watson might be the only guy in NFL history where you could say, yeah, I think he's an even worse person than he is a football player. But anyway, he's been terrible this season. The Browns should move on from him. And if he can just get the ball to Amari Cooper this week, Amari Cooper should be able to put up a lot of fantasy points. Now, one guy I do want to mention, but I'm not going to officially put him on the buy list, especially considering y'all would call me a Texas homer if I did, is Xavier Worthy, the Kansas City Chiefs. Basically, this Chiefs offense is running out of guys to throw to. And Xavier Worthy is a guy who is going to get targeted deep down the field. He's going to get these rush attempts that are designed touches that are easy fantasy points. He's going to be utilized in this offense. And all it takes for Worthy is just a bomb or two to score, and he can put up a great fantasy performance like he did against the Chargers. He was only targeted 4 times, but he only needed 4 targets to put up 16.3 fantasy points because one of those targets was a 54-yard bomb for a touchdown. So I do think that this is a good spot to buy Xavier Worthy, where his volume is going to increase, which increases the likelihood that he breaks off deep plays. And so I think this is a pretty good spot for Xavier Worthy. Now, the other receiver that is officially on the buy list is Deontay Johnson of the Carolina Panthers. So you guys remember that stat about Amari Cooper being wide receiver 4 in expected fantasy points per game? Well, what if I told you that Deontay Johnson was wide receiver 3 in expected fantasy points per game, trailing only Nico Collins and Malik Neighbors? Yes, that is the case with Deontay Johnson, because he was seeing a decent amount of targets under Bryce Young, and they were just not all catchable. They were not all on target. They didn't translate to a lot of success, but they have been against Andy Dalton, and the volume has been increasing. In fact, Deontay Johnson's been so good, he's scored over 50 fantasy points, DraftKings points, over the last 2 weeks, which ranks him as the wide receiver 3 in the last 2 weeks when you just look at weeks 3 and 4 when Andy Dalton was starting. And he's had 27 total targets in those 2 weeks. That's just an incredible, insane workload. You got to attribute a little bit of that to Adam Thielen being hurt, but to me, it just makes it a great spot for Deontay Johnson to continue to see ridiculous volume. And the Bears, statistically on paper, look like a bad matchup, but I really don't care about the matchup when you're getting this much volume. Now, another thing with Deontay Johnson is this is like the NFL's weirdest rivalry game this week, the Panthers and Bears. There's a lot of hatred on Twitter amongst these two fan bases, largely stemming from the Bryce Young trade, which turned into, you could now call it the Caleb Williams trade. And they played last year on Thursday night, and it was just an awful, hideous football game. But, this is like a weird rivalry. And so these two teams are going to come in and want to win to kind of show that they won the trade, even though the Bears obviously won the trade. And so I do think that this is going to be a game that has a little bit of added motivation. It would not shock me if this game ends up turning into a shootout, because that's just, to me, the type of game that this lines up to be. I could see this being an absolutely crazy game. You have the DJ Moore revenge narrative on the other side as well. So DJ Moore, who is actually also a top 10 receiver in expected fantasy points per game, could also have a big day. But Deontay Johnson is the guy that's ending up on my buy list. Now, in the if you're desperate category, I want to talk about Brian Thomas Jr. So Brian Thomas Jr. is a guy that I'm going to mention, not because of his overall volume of targets, which is pretty good. He's at 18 over the last 2 weeks, but because of the because of how lucrative his targets have been. There we go. I think that's how you say that. His targets have been lucrative. And what I mean by that is when Brian Thomas Jr. gets targeted, he gets targeted deep. He gets targeted in the red zone. Those are cheat codes for fantasy football right there. And really, he's what I call a red zone guy. Not because of his use in the actual red zone, but because if you're watching NFL red zone, it seems like every time they cut away, the Jaguars are targeting Brian Thomas Jr. Why? Because he gets targets that are deep and red zone shows them because they're big plays, or he gets targets in the red zone because red zone's on that game because they're in the red zone, right? So Brian Thomas Jr., to me, because of the way he's being targeted against this Indianapolis defense that is not very good, I think he's in a great spot to have a big game. Next up, we also already mentioned Dontavion Wicks for the Green Bay Packers. I think this is a great buy low spot for Dontavion Wicks. And then Tutu Atwell of the Los Angeles Rams, I do want to mention. So basically, the Rams' offense has been significantly changed with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua being hurt. Tutu Atwell has turned into the beneficiary, double-digit fantasy points in each of the last 2 weeks, and he has not scored a touchdown in either of those weeks. He is another guy like Brian Thomas Jr. that gets targeted deep down the field, which should end up, if you get enough chances at it, you should connect with one. I think he's in a pretty good spot against Green Bay to end up actually finding the end zone. Now, at the tight end position, we're going to keep it short. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I forgot the sell list because the sell list is easy this week. Sell the Miami Dolphins passing offense. Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, anybody else. I just have zero faith that this passing offense can function without Tua Tagovailoa. I've seen 3 games of it. They tried to get Tyreek the ball in creative situations, running and screen passes and all that against Tennessee. It just didn't work out. Just this offense can't run without Tua. With the other guys they've been playing at quarterback. And as much as it pains me to say, because I did draft him in a few of my season-long leagues this year, I think you got to bench Tyreek Hill if you have decent options. Like, honestly, he just, as good as he is, he's one of the best receivers in the league. But the way this passing offense has looked the past 3 weeks, I just don't think you can play him. And so if you have a better option, get a better option in there. This goes for Jalen Waddle as well, except I'd have an even shorter leash on Jalen Waddle. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the tight end position. So this one's going to be short because the tight end position has just been a wasteland this year. Like, it's been truly, truly bad. We mentioned on the week 3 show how NFL offenses have been operating differently because of the way NFL defenses have played them. Well, the overall lack of passing volume, the overall lack of passing touchdowns is carrying over into the tight end position, and they're not scoring as much touchdowns. They're not getting as much usage. Like, it's been a wasteland out there at the tight end position this week. So I'm not going to have any tight end on the sell list because they've all been bad, if we're being honest. There are 2 tight ends on the buy list, though. One of them is a Sunday night special, Jake Ferguson of the Dallas Cowboys. So last year, Jake Ferguson was well noted because of how often he was targeted in the red zone. Well, now he is starting to get targeted all over the field. 18 targets in the last 2 games against Baltimore and the Giants, and he didn't score a touchdown in either game, and he still had decent fantasy performances. So I'm willing to buy that, he continues to see these red zone targets that he got last year, and he continues to see the targets that he's gotten all over the field this year. And he turns into a big game one of these days where he ends up scoring multiple touchdowns. This could be the week for that because Pittsburgh is really stingy to outside wide receivers. I do think you can target them over the middle of the field in a way that Jake Ferguson can do. I also want to put Tucker Kraft on the buy list. So if you remember back during best ball drafting season, if you play best ball, the Packers tight end you quote unquote wanted to draft was Luke Musgrave. But when you look at how both of them were used when they were active last year, Tucker Kraft was actually the tight end with the better usage. Everybody just talked themselves into Luke Musgrave because he had better draft capital. He was the starter at the start of last season, yada, yada, yada. Well, anyway, the guy you want now is Tucker Kraft, especially with the injury to Christian Watson narrowing down this Packers receiving room. Tucker Kraft had 9 targets last week. I'm not saying that he's going to get that again, but I'm saying there's a chance he could, and he's a guy that is probably available on the waiver wire in your season-long fantasy league. I certainly think he's worth a look. I certainly don't think he should be on waivers as a tight end that is in one of the league's best offenses. All right, that is going to do it for week 5 of the 2024 NFL season. Like I said from the top, hopefully gave you guys plenty of information that you guys can use to win in season-long fantasy, to make some winning DFS lineups, and to win in the player props market this week. That is the goal. So no matter what game you're playing, hopefully I got you covered and gave you guys some nuggets that you can use to win. If this video helped you out in any way, please hit the like button on YouTube. Please rate and review the audio. It really does help me out a ton when you guys do that, and I really do appreciate it. But that's going to do it for this episode, y'all. So thank you guys for watching and listening to this point. We will be back next week with more NFL content in addition to college football, golf, college basketball coming in November. So make sure you're subscribed and can be here for that. But thank you guys for watching and listening to this point. Best of luck in all your matchups with your DFS lineups and your bets this week. And I will see you guys next time.